My daughter has finally decided that she wants to be a game master, and I couldn't be a prouder daddy. But watching her go through all the different phases that one goes through in becoming a game master over time, and I can do a different video on that. I don't want to jump into that too much today, but watching her grow as a game master, I thought to myself, well, I want to put together like the top 3 things that I would want to say to somebody if I was trying to give a new game master advice. So here we go, the top 3 things that I would give to new game masters as advice from a guy who's been doing it for way too long. Number 1, talk to your players. And a lot of times we have character creation sessions where everyone can sit around together and talk about what they want to build and all that stuff. And that's fine. However, I do strongly encourage one-to-ones with your players, because your players don't always feel comfortable talking about things in front of the other players, particularly if they've got like super secret ideas that they're trying to throw together. And so not only do I like to talk to my players so that we all have a similar understanding of what they expect their characters to be, but also I like to try and create long-term goals for people's characters so that my players, it helps create investment in the players when they know this is coming up, right? You almost like throwing a carrot out there for your players, and you're saying, yes, you've got this thing coming up and I'm going to work it into the story. And it really creates that engagement, because they're like, oh, well, now they're looking out for that opportunity for this thing to happen for their character that they're playing. Number 2, I strongly recommend that you roll the dice less. I know that sounds really weird. It's tabletop role-playing, right? Rolling dice is part of the game. And it's absolutely right. Rolling dice is part of the game. But it shouldn't decide everything. And I think that's something that I had to grow out of as a game master. Is at first I was lost, and I didn't have the confidence to make decisions, and I didn't have the practice to make decisions on the fly. And so they'd say like, is there a particular item in this store? Well, let's roll for it and find out. No, forget that. Honestly, get away from that as soon as you can. For me, every scene that the players are in is setting up for the next scene, the next part. It's like watching a movie, right? I get it. Some people like open world role playing. I don't anymore. I used to love that. I used to spend hours of role-playing games, sitting around the table, chasing the most asinine things that the players could think of doing. And I'm at a point in my life and in my career as a game master where I say, you know what, I want to tell stories. I enjoy telling stories, and I enjoy having everyone contribute to the story that we're telling together. And spending days worth and hours worth of role-playing time just chasing after the most inane things because the players get this idea in their heads that something may be relevant. It's like, no, don't be afraid to quash that and be like, no. Look, the story's going over here. Let's do this thing over here. And I have that established kind of idea with my players where it's like, okay, this scene is going to set you up for the next scene, and that scene will set you up for the following scene, and eventually we're going to get to the end game boss, right? And that might sound like the game's on rails, and maybe it is a little bit. But at the end of the day, I mean, as long as you guys are enjoying what you're doing, it's fine. Me personally, I like to tell the story. And I want my players to get into telling the story with me. And so I don't roll the dice as much. In fact, there have been sessions where I don't roll the dice at all because I have an overall goal. And I can let the players' rolls, if they roll, decide a lot of that stuff. And at the end of the day, if that works for you, that's great. That's really what works strongly for me. Is I want to tell the story. I want my players to tell the story. If I want my players to end up in a certain location, that's where the clues are going to take them, very clearly and defined. Your clue says right over there, and if they go, I'm going to go over here, maybe I'll punish that. Honestly, I'll do that. Like they're going to say, well, I know that the clues are obvious in this direction, but I'm going to go over there and check out this bar. Well, it turns out that bar is full of bruisers and they kick your ass. But they kick your butt. And so that will naturally guide the players back in the direction that the story actually should be going, right? Rolling the dice should create suspense. I think that's really what it is, what it comes down to, is that rather than having it be a decision-making tool for you. Use it to create suspense, because ultimately the player should end up, and the story and the fight should play out the way that you as the game master and the story requires the fight to turn out. And I think that it does you and the players a disservice to allow the dice to completely derail the story in the sense of, oh, well, that's what the rules say. Well, guess what? I'm the game master. What I say goes. Number 3, and I think this it's right on par with number 2 as far as overall challenge is concerned, but number 3, I think that ultimately players want to play competent characters, which means that we should not be using the dice rolls to punish them. I think that ultimately, like for example, the way that I treat critical fails is probably very different than the way other game masters treat critical fails, because anytime the player fails, I always make it about things just didn't go their way, as opposed to they weren't good enough to make the thing happen. For example, let's say Tempest the Thief has to break into a building in order to steal a thing, right? And so she chooses to take a grappling hook, throw it across the street from a neighboring building, and lodges it in the window of the room that she has to steal from. And she ties off the other end, and she's going to tightrope walk across that rope. Unfortunately, her player did not roll well. She rolls a 1 for the acrobatics check to get across that rope. Okay, now typically what ends up happening then is that the game master would say, well, then your character falls off the rope and lands in the street and gets hurt. It's a pretty straightforward way to treat a critical fail. However, it derails the story entirely. It derails the game entirely. Instead, what I would say is, oh, she rolled a she rolled a 1, no big deal. As she gets halfway across, so now it sounds like, oh my God, something really bad's going to happen now, right? As she gets halfway across, the rope snaps and she begins to fall. Luckily, though, she grabs onto the rope and goes swinging into one of the lower floor windows. And now, bad stuff has happened. The character didn't get exactly what they wanted, but the character still made it into the building, and now you've created a setback without completely destroying the character's competence. And I think that's important to building up your players so that they eventually are willing to take risks and they're willing to do things that otherwise they might say, well, why would I try that? Because if I roll a 1 or if I don't roll well, then horrible things are going to happen to me and my characters. So always, 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 whether the players succeed or fail, I use the rolls to drive the story forward. And at the end of the day, I think that is probably your best bet as far as having smooth running games where your players are having fun. And even if their characters don't do well, like, oh man, that stinks, let's just go ahead and keep driving forward, right? Have those characters that are resilient and players that are resilient, and they don't get hung up on, oh, I didn't do well this time, or I didn't do that this time. Ultimately, it's on us as game masters to create that situation and create that suspense without relying on outside things. I think that ultimately, as you grow as a game master, you want to do those things. You want to grow. You want to drive the story forward, drive the adventure forward, so that there's never a big, I don't know how that happened, or I wish that happened, or what. So there you have it. 3 things that I, as a game master over the years, have come to learn and decide that, yeah, these are things that I want to focus on in order to be a better game master, to have my games go more smoothly and not spend hours chasing things that don't necessarily drive the story forward. Once again, this is just my advice. This is, if you're into that sandbox, let's just hang out, roll dice, and laugh, then by all means, do your thing. But if you're like me, you get to a point where you are frustrated and you want things to go differently. These 3 things have really helped me to drive my games forward, improve my relationship with my players, and grant me a ton more control over how things go. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked what I did here, go ahead and hit a like. Feel free to hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you guys around the table next time.